was the Just Blaze connection one of those kind of Just Blaze changed my life situations where had you not met him, would your trajectory have maybe been different and not so focused on music?
This will always be the funniest story, but it goes, again, it's a part of the hilarious lore of these kids in the hall. So all this overconfidence, all this stuff, right? As me thinking that my music is better than it needs to be. And had knowledge demos. The partner that I had in the production company when I first moved to LA, we thought we were going to get this deal with, I don't know if you remember 310 Motoring at the time, which was like a really big, it's like what Platinum is now, but it was basically like they did all of the rappers' cars, things like that. And they were starting a record label and they liked what we had made. And they were like, oh yeah, we want to sign you guys. So I moved out thinking like, I just graduated. I'm about to get a deal. This is all cool. And then all of it fell apart. And then they eventually got, indicted by the feds and all kinds of other stuff. But that's later on. But I immediately had to start from scratch all over again. Because I moved out with like $2,500 to LA, sleeping on my friend's floor, thinking that was about to be the deal and had to start from square one. And I ended up getting a job, hilariously enough, at T-Mobile, because at the time we were not like in a full recession, but we were in something of sorts that reminded us of that during that administration. And that was the only job I could get easily. And the day that I start working is the day the Sidekick comes out. So the first T-Mobile Sidekick comes out, and the first thing I say is I'm like, this is going to kill it in the music industry. And I had like one or two connections at the time, but I basically, from a T-Mobile retail store in Westwood and then eventually Santa Monica, become the guy that is selling the Sidekick to everyone in the music industry. For some reason, when T-Mobile had released it, it released in like LA and wasn't really in New York yet. So it was on the West Coast. Shout out to another producer, Gerard Harmon, who was producing for MC Light at the time, and another, a publicist, Echo Haddix. Everyone just started sending everyone in the industry to me. And I became that guy for people like Ja Rule, Snoop, a ton of people. I'm literally just selling them T-Mobile Sidekicks at scale. And one of those guys becomes Just Blaze. He's this huge tech head. And so that's where we meet and begin. And yeah, it absolutely changed my life because I go from being a person who literally is just wearing a T-Mobile shirt, selling Sidekicks, the black and white ones too, to people in the industry, to being a person that just confided in enough that every time he was in LA, it's like, yo, pull up to the studio, or he had some new stuff. And we always sort of started our relationship just based on like tech, fun things, music. And then it was like a year or two later where I actually started saying, oh, hey, here, I'm a producer. Here's some beats.
Okay. So you waited a whole year to even
absolutely
divulge that you were a producer to just, okay. Cause a lot of people wouldn't have done that. They would have immediately been like Sidekick, but here's the demo CD in the Sidekick folder.
Yeah. It was, immediately when the music stuff stopped working and I was working at T-Mobile, it was like, okay, I had taken off probably about 5 or 6 months from training in terms of tracks. So I was like, let me get into that. And then that kind of became the pivot. Still making and producing music all the time, but was a little bit focused more on work in that. And then whenever Just would come in, just hanging out in the studio and just sort of learning, also having the ability to kind of be a fly on the wall during that time. It really wasn't until the first Kids in the Hall stuff started coming together that the music stuff, even for him, he hears producers all the time, right? Something I always try to tell young artists and producers is don't be discouraged if your heroes or your, people that you look up to don't necessarily immediately say, oh, this is the greatest and hottest thing you've ever made. I'm going to put you on. Because if that happens, it's only because you're immediately useful to them. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but I mean that in a way like if they see that you can be immediately a part of their workflow, their situation, that is how you're going to kind of immediately get in those spaces. And don't be discouraged, because it may just be that what you're doing, they don't necessarily need, but it doesn't mean that the world doesn't need it. I think a lot of times people get caught up and discouraged because they, so-and-so didn't like my beats or didn't put me on in some way. And it's just like, when a lot of times, sometimes you're getting put on because they're going to exploit your talents for their gain and benefit. And not to say that Just was going to do that, but, you know, it wasn't like all of a sudden we were co-producing stuff, right? It was just me playing music for him, playing music. And then when Kids in the Hall connected, it was like, oh yeah, I like this. And I'm about to start a label. At the time, he had just got the label deal with Saigon at Atlantic. And so then we became a useful part of the larger world of Just Blaze. And that ended up being sort of the path that led to success. But yeah.
You've obviously been in music and in the culture for a very long time. And I think we can pull out some of the qualities from some of the stories that you've told, whether it's networking or other things. But, you know, just as a quick list for some of the listeners, like what are some of the qualities that you think you have or grown to have that have allowed you to exist in the space for this long?
I always go back to this quote that I heard from Erykah Badu years ago, but it's basically, you know, always be of service and you'll have a job and position to do something in this game. I think it's understanding that coupled with the flexibility of identity, right? And knowing that at the end of the day, I'm still a producer. There's still a keyboard right here. There's still a push. There's still all of those things. And I'm going to make what I need to make in order to make me happy. If that comes out on a TV commercial, if that comes out on an album, or if that comes out on YouTube, or if that comes out, you know, as a remix that I'm DJing, it's all the same stuff. And I'm not holding on to the idea that I have to be a very specific kind of producer. Because it also could be me touching nothing. And in the marketing space that I am now, putting together an event, putting together a project as a marketing activation, and producing it from the larger holistic sort of standpoint. I think the biggest thing people get caught up in is what their internal identity is telling them that they are and should be. And when that does not always jive with what reality is, it can lead to just a ton of frustration. And
unfortunately, the reality is, and you told this similar stories that exemplified this earlier in the conversation, where, you know, the artist gets signed, all of a sudden you who developed the sound, you get pushed aside because the label has their own producers, their own A&Rs, and now they're putting the artist that you thought you were on a team with in the room with all these producers, and you end up with one track on the album and it's the bonus track. You know what I mean? And like, yeah, someone huge has the single. How did that work out in this instance where you and Nikki Jean are developing sound? Then what happens when she gets signed to Rhymesayers? And now what is your current involvement in her musical output?
So I would say that I came in more of like a producer, but more of like a creative director, if that makes sense. You know, she by herself plays multiple instruments, one of the best singer-songwriters that I know, can do do it all sort of herself, and didn't have any need for a single producer to do things. I think ultimately it's figuring out what the artist actually needs and how you can, provide that. I think you know, hopefully this will, I mean, I don't know how long it'll take for this to come out, but we talk, you know, Quincy Jones just passed, right? And when you look at the arc of his career and all the things that he was a part of, oftentimes they're very different roles ultimately, you know, through that, from musician to producer, executive producer, co-producer, any and all of those things. And I think as I've gotten older, I respected that version and vision of a producer more than the original version, which was like, no, I have to take the weirdest sounds and, you know, and put them in the MPC and mess around with them. Right. Because even with that, of the projects that we put out, I probably really was only producing like maybe 1 or 2 records. I learned a lot about collaboration on that and what it's going to take to get the right kind of sounds and sonics in for the version of the record that she liked. Because for that very specifically, you're talking about something that starts at the piano or on guitar, you know, as opposed to previously in Kids in the Hall with Knowledge, where it's oftentimes either starting with the beat or maybe with a freestyle on something else, right? And so it's a much different view of production of like, okay, how do you turn this thing that is just that into a full-fledged produced record?